In the bitter winter of 1879, in the remote railroad settlement of Millbrook Crossing, Missouri, 28-year-old Evangeline Harwick became the subject of the most extraordinary medical phenomenon ever documented in the Western Territories. Dr. Cornelius Whitman, a distinguished neurologist from Johns Hopkins who had traveled west to study frontier psychology, filled 17 leather-bound journals with observations about a woman who claimed she had not experienced a single moment of sleep in over 7 years. For 11 months, 9 residents of Millbrook Crossing suffered complete psychological collapses, while nearly half the town's population reported shared nightmares so vivid and terrifying that they began refusing to sleep, creating a cascade of mass hysteria that threatened to destroy the entire community. The comprehensive medical documentation was immediately seized by federal authorities and classified under the Territorial Health Protection Act, where it remained buried in government archives for over 140 years. But the truth about Evangeline Harwick reveals a mystery that challenges everything we understand about human consciousness, the nature of dreams, and the thin boundary between waking reality and the realm of sleep. Before we continue with the extraordinary story of Evangeline Harwick and the psychological plague that consumed Millbrook Crossing, if this tale captures your imagination, make sure to subscribe to our channel and activate that notification bell so you never miss our explorations into America's most bewildering medical mysteries. And please share in the comments which state or region you're watching from. We love connecting with fellow mystery enthusiasts from around the globe who appreciate these deep dives into the unexplained corners of our history. The Missouri of 1879 existed in a state of profound transformation. While eastern cities like St. Louis and Kansas City embraced the Industrial Revolution with steamboats, telegraph lines, and growing immigrant populations, the western regions remained largely untamed frontier territory. The Transcontinental Railroad had connected the coasts, but dozens of smaller branch lines were still being constructed across Missouri's rugged landscape, creating temporary settlements that served the armies of workers laying track through wilderness. Millbrook Crossing had emerged in the spring of 1878 as one such railroad town, established where the newly constructed Missouri and Arkansas line crossed Millbrook Creek, about 40 miles southwest of Springfield. The settlement served as a supply depot and temporary headquarters for railroad construction crews working their way toward the Arkansas border. What had begun as a cluster of tents and temporary structures had evolved into a semi-permanent community of approximately 400 residents, including railroad workers, their families, local merchants, and the inevitable collection of gamblers, saloon keepers, and other entrepreneurs who followed construction crews across the frontier. The town itself reflected its temporary nature and rapid construction. Main Street consisted of a dozen wooden buildings housing essential businesses: Henderson's General Store, the Railroad Inn, Murphy's Saloon, a blacksmith shop, and the combination post office and telegraph station that maintained Millbrook Crossing's connection to the outside world. Most residents lived in simple frame houses or converted railroad cars, their lives governed by the rhythms of construction work and the ever-present possibility that the town might be abandoned once the railroad pushed further west. The isolation of Millbrook Crossing was its defining characteristic and its greatest vulnerability. The nearest established town, Carthage, lay a hard day's ride to the northeast, while Springfield required 2 days of travel over rough terrain that became nearly impassable during winter months. This geographic isolation created a tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone else's business, but it also meant that unusual events could develop without outside scrutiny or intervention. The winter of 1878 to 79 had been particularly harsh, with heavy snows and bitter cold that halted railroad construction for months and trapped the community in an enforced hibernation. Supplies ran low, tempers grew short, and the combination of cabin fever and economic uncertainty created an atmosphere of tension and unease that would prove fertile ground for the extraordinary events that followed. Dr. Cornelius Whitman had arrived in Millbrook Crossing in October 1879, not as a frontier physician, but as a medical researcher pursuing what he called environmental psychology, the study of how extreme living conditions affected human mental health. A graduate of Johns Hopkins Medical School and former student of pioneering alienist Dr. Henry Maudsley, Whitman had gained recognition in Eastern medical circles for his papers on industrial neurosis, mass hysteria, and what he termed isolation psychosis. At 35, Whitman was considered one of the most promising young neurologists in America, with a particular interest in sleep disorders and their relationship to mental illness. His decision to study frontier communities had been motivated by reports of unusual psychological phenomena in isolated Western settlements, entire towns experiencing shared delusions, epidemic sleepwalking, and collective behavioral changes that seemed to spread like contagious diseases.
Whitman had established his temporary practice in 2 rooms above Henderson's general store, creating both a treatment space for local residents and a research facility where he could document the psychological effects of frontier isolation. His presence in Millbrook Crossing was initially met with suspicion. Educated Eastern doctors were viewed with skepticism by railroad workers and their families. But his genuine medical skills and respectful approach to local customs gradually earned the community's trust. Unlike the typical frontier doctor, who dealt primarily with injuries and infectious diseases, Whitman was specifically interested in the mental health challenges of isolated communities. He had already documented several cases of what he called frontier melancholia, a condition characterized by profound depression, social withdrawal, and disturbing dreams that seemed to affect individuals who had been isolated from larger communities for extended periods. Whitman's medical background included extensive training in the emerging field of sleep research, a discipline that was just beginning to understand the relationship between sleep patterns and mental health. His journals from this period reveal a methodical, scientifically trained mind grappling with phenomena that challenged the medical understanding of his era. Evangeline Harwick arrived in Millbrook Crossing on the afternoon freight train in early November 1879, carrying only a small leather satchel and wearing a traveling dress that had seen better days. She was accompanied by Mrs. Cordelia Voss, an elderly woman who introduced herself as Evangeline's former employer and claimed to be escorting her to a new position as a seamstress and general household assistant. Evangeline was striking in appearance, though not conventionally beautiful. She stood nearly 6 feet tall, unusually statuesque for a woman of that era, with auburn hair that she wore in an elaborate braided crown and pale green eyes that seemed to reflect light in an almost luminescent manner. Her skin was extraordinarily pale, with the translucent quality of fine porcelain, and she moved with a fluid grace that made her seem to glide rather than walk. What immediately distinguished Evangeline from other new arrivals was her remarkable composure and alertness. While most travelers who arrived after the arduous journey from Springfield appeared tired and disheveled, Evangeline seemed perfectly fresh and energetic, as if she had just awakened from a refreshing rest rather than endured hours of uncomfortable train travel. Mrs. Voss arranged accommodation for Evangeline at the Railroad Inn and announced that the young woman would be available for sewing, mending, and general household work. She explained that Evangeline had previously worked for several prominent families in Kansas City, but had requested a change of scenery for personal reasons that Mrs. Voss declined to elaborate upon. Miss Harwick is an exceptionally capable young woman. She requires very little supervision and is capable of working at all hours. I believe you'll find her services quite valuable, particularly during the busy periods when you need assistance both day and night." The phrasing struck Sarah Henderson as oddly specific, but frontier communities were accustomed to accepting workers with minimal background information. The isolation of railroad towns meant that many residents were escaping complicated pasts or seeking new opportunities away from the scrutiny of established communities. Within days of Evangeline's arrival in Millbrook Crossing, residents of Millbrook Crossing began noticing unusual patterns in her behavior that distinguished her from every other person in the settlement. Most notably, Evangeline appeared to maintain the same level of energy and alertness throughout both day and night hours, showing no signs of the fatigue that affected everyone else in the community. Thomas Murphy, proprietor of the town saloon, was among the first to comment on Evangeline's unusual schedule. His establishment remained open until midnight most evenings, serving railroad workers who preferred drinking to sleeping during their time off. Murphy began noticing that Evangeline could be seen walking the streets at all hours, sometimes carrying bundles of completed sewing work, sometimes simply moving through the town with apparent purpose.
More disturbing reports began emerging from families who had hired Evangeline for household work. Rebecca Patterson, wife of railroad foreman James Patterson, had engaged Evangeline to help with seasonal preparations and winter sewing. Rebecca reported that Evangeline would arrive in the evening to collect work and return before dawn with completed projects, accomplishing in a single night what would typically require several days of normal labor. The quality of her work was extraordinary, Rebecca told other women in the community. Perfect stitches, complex patterns completed flawlessly, repairs that looked better than the original construction. But the speed was impossible. I'd give her enough work to keep a normal seamstress busy for a week, and she'd return it finished before breakfast. When Rebecca questioned Evangeline about her working methods, the young woman simply smiled and explained that she had always been a night person who found darkness conducive to detailed work. She claimed that the quiet hours allowed her to concentrate without distractions, and that she had trained herself to work efficiently during periods when most people preferred to sleep. Dr. Whitman first encountered Evangeline in late November 1879, when Rebecca Patterson requested a medical consultation about what she described as unusual behavior in her household assistant. Patterson was not complaining about Evangeline's work quality, which remained exceptional, but had become concerned about the young woman's apparent complete lack of sleep. "Doctor, I've been watching carefully for 3 weeks," Patterson explained during her visit to Whitman's office. "I've never seen that woman show any sign of tiredness. She works through the night, appears at my door before sunrise looking perfectly fresh, spends the day helping with household tasks, and shows no indication that she ever rests. It's not natural, and it's starting to worry me." Whitman's initial response was skeptical. Medical training had taught him that claims of complete sleeplessness were typically exaggerations or misunderstandings. Most people who claimed to never sleep were actually experiencing frequent brief periods of rest that they didn't recognize as sleep, or were suffering from insomnia that made their sleep feel insufficient despite actually occurring. However, Patterson's detailed observations and obvious sincerity convinced Whitman to investigate further. He arranged to meet with Evangeline under the pretext of conducting routine health examinations for new residents, a practice he had established both for medical research purposes and to provide basic health care to the isolated community. Evangeline appeared at Whitman's office on a cold December morning, punctual and composed despite the early hour. Whitman's initial examination revealed a healthy woman showing no obvious signs of sleep deprivation. Her reflexes were sharp, her cognitive responses quick and accurate, her physical coordination excellent. Most tellingly, she displayed none of the irritability, confusion, or emotional instability that typically accompanied chronic insomnia. "Ms. Harwick," Whitman began carefully, "Mrs. Patterson mentioned that you maintain rather unusual working hours. How many hours of sleep would you estimate you get each night?" "I don't sleep, Dr. Whitman," Evangeline replied directly, her pale green eyes meeting his with steady confidence. "I have not slept since the spring of 1872. I find that sleep is unnecessary for my constitution, and the nighttime hours are far too valuable to waste in unconsciousness." The statement was delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty that Whitman initially assumed it was a figure of speech or philosophical observation rather than a literal medical claim. But Evangeline's demeanor suggested complete sincerity, and her physical appearance supported the possibility that her sleep patterns were genuinely unusual. "When you say you don't sleep, do you mean that you sleep very little, or that you experience difficulty falling asleep, or that you sleep in brief periods that don't feel restful?" "I mean that I have not experienced unconsciousness or dreams since March 15, 1872. I remain fully alert and aware throughout every hour of every day. I neither require nor desire the state that others call sleep." Whitman's detailed examination of Evangeline revealed a collection of physical characteristics that contradicted everything he understood about human sleep requirements. Her pulse was steady and strong, her blood pressure normal, her reflexes sharp and consistent. Most remarkably, her eyes showed none of the redness, puffiness, or strain typical of chronic sleep deprivation. More puzzling were the cognitive tests that Whitman administered to assess mental acuity and emotional stability. Evangeline performed exceptionally well on memory tasks, mathematical calculations, and logical reasoning problems. Her attention span appeared unlimited, and she showed no signs of the concentration difficulties that invariably accompanied sleep disorders. "Miss Harwick," Whitman said during the examination, "I must ask about your medical history. Have you always had unusual sleep patterns, or did this change occur at a specific time?" "The change occurred 7 years, 8 months, and 12 days ago," Evangeline replied, with startling precision. "Prior to that date, I experienced normal sleep patterns like other people. Since that time, I have found sleep both unnecessary and impossible."
Harold approached me as the party was winding down. "Dorothy, I have something to tell you. Remember that first day when you called me about Garrett and Sabrina's target list? Of course. I never told you this, but my name was on that list. They'd researched me as a potential victim before they settled on targeting you." I stared at him in surprise. "You were a target too?" "I was. But because you figured out their scheme and warned me, they never had the chance to approach me. You didn't just save yourself, Margaret, and all the other potential victims. You saved me too." As I looked around at the party filled with people whose lives had been touched by our experience, I realized that this was Garrett and Sabrina's true legacy. Not the homes they'd stolen or the lives they'd damaged, but the community of protectors they'd inadvertently created by trying to destroy mine. They'd intended to make me a victim. Instead, they'd made me a warrior. At 75, I was just getting started. The final toast of the evening came from an unexpected source. Detective Chen, now Chief Chen after her promotion, raised her glass and said, "To Dorothy Caldwell, who proved that the best defense against criminals who target the elderly is elderly people who refuse to be targets." As everyone raised their glasses, I thought about the scared, lonely woman I'd been just a few years earlier. She would have never imagined that her worst nightmare would become her greatest triumph. But then again, she would have never imagined how strong she really was. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever encountered someone trying to take advantage of you or a loved one? How did you handle it? What warning signs should people watch for? Share your experiences in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about standing up for yourself and protecting the people you love. Remember, you're never too old to fight back, and you're never too vulnerable to be valuable. Trust your instincts, ask for help, and never let anyone convince you that you don't deserve respect. Thank you for following my journey from victim to victor. I hope my story helps you or someone you love stay safe and strong.
"Henry," Whitman said gently, approaching the man with the caution he had learned to use with patients experiencing psychological episodes. "Can you hear me? It's Dr. Whitman." Ashworth continued his frantic telegraph work, speaking in a monotone voice that seemed to come from somewhere far away. "She's in the wires, doctor. She's traveling through the telegraph lines, sending messages to everyone who's sleeping. I can hear her voice coming through from every station between here and St. Louis. She's telling them all the same thing, over and over." Mrs. Ashworth, a practical woman who had endured 2 years of frontier life without complaint, was visibly shaken by her husband's condition. "He's been like this for hours, doctor. Started around midnight, saying he could hear someone talking through the telegraph. Claims it's that Harwick woman, but that's impossible. She's never been near the telegraph office." Whitman examined Ashworth carefully, finding elevated pulse, dilated pupils, and the characteristic signs of severe psychological distress. Most concerning was the man's apparent conviction that he was receiving telepathic communications through the telegraph system, a delusion that seemed completely disconnected from his previously rational personality. "What is she telling them, Henry?" Whitman asked, hoping to understand the content of Ashworth's hallucinations. "That sleep is a prison," Ashworth replied without stopping his mechanical telegraph work. "That dreams are lies we tell ourselves to avoid seeing the truth. That consciousness is the only pure state, and anyone who sleeps is surrendering their will to forces they can't control. She's teaching them how to stay awake forever, how to break free from the tyranny of unconsciousness." The specificity and coherence of Ashworth's delusions disturbed Whitman far more than random psychotic rambling would have. The content seemed too organized, too thematically consistent to represent typical mental breakdown. Moreover, the focus on sleep and consciousness directly paralleled Evangeline Harwick's own unusual condition and expressed beliefs. Following Ashworth's collapse, Dr. Whitman began conducting systematic interviews with every resident of Millbrook Crossing, documenting sleep patterns, dream content, and any unusual experiences that might be connected to the growing psychological disturbances in the community. What he discovered painted a disturbing picture of a settlement under siege by forces that medical science was ill-equipped to understand or combat. Nearly every family reported that at least one member was experiencing significant sleep disruption since Evangeline's arrival. Children were particularly affected, with parents describing nightmares so vivid and terrifying that the young victims refused to sleep without multiple family members present. The content of these nightmares showed remarkable consistency. Children reported dreams of being watched by the pale lady with green eyes, who urged them to stay awake and see the world as it really is. Adult residents were experiencing their own sleep-related problems, though typically less severe than the children's night terrors.
Railroad workers reported difficulty falling asleep after shifts, insomnia that left them exhausted but unable to find rest. Several women mentioned dreams that felt more real than waking life, involving conversations with Evangeline that seemed to continue themes and discussions from their daytime interactions. Most disturbing were the reports of shared dream experiences. Multiple residents described having identical or nearly identical dreams involving Evangeline, often featuring the same locations, conversations, and symbolic imagery. Thomas Murphy reported dreaming of Evangeline standing in his saloon after closing time, explaining to invisible customers why alcohol was just another form of escape from consciousness. Rebecca Patterson described dreams where Evangeline demonstrated sewing techniques that Patterson later found she could perform perfectly despite never having learned them while awake. "It's like she's teaching us things while we sleep," Patterson confided to Dr. Whitman during one of his investigative interviews. "Skills, ideas, ways of thinking that feel foreign but somehow familiar. I'll wake up knowing things I didn't know before, understanding concepts that I'd never encountered. It should be helpful, but instead it feels like an invasion, like someone is rearranging my thoughts without permission." Whitman documented these reports with growing alarm, recognizing patterns that challenged fundamental assumptions about the boundaries between individual consciousness and collective experience. His medical training had included study of Franz Anton Mesmer's theories about animal magnetism and the possibility of mental influence between individuals, but the phenomena in Millbrook Crossing seemed to operate on a scale and with a precision that exceeded anything described in contemporary psychological literature. By early January 1880, the sleep disturbances in Millbrook Crossing had evolved into something resembling an epidemic of parasomnia, complex sleep disorders that caused people to engage in elaborate activities while technically unconscious. Nearly a dozen residents were experiencing regular episodes of sleepwalking, but these were not the random, confused wanderings typical of the condition. Instead, the sleepwalkers moved with apparent purpose and coordination, often gathering in specific locations around the town as if responding to unheard summons. Dr. Whitman began conducting nighttime observations, positioning himself where he could monitor the movements of affected residents without interfering with their unconscious activities. What he witnessed challenged every scientific principle he understood about sleep and consciousness.
The sleepwalkers moved in coordinated patterns, as if following invisible pathways through the town. They would emerge from their homes at different times, but converge on specific locations: the area around Evangeline's boarding house, the railroad platform, and most frequently, a small clearing near Millbrook Creek where the community had originally planned to build a church before winter weather halted construction. In the clearing, the sleepwalkers would arrange themselves in rough circles, standing motionless for hours while appearing to listen to something that Whitman could not hear. Occasionally, one of them would speak, but the words were often incomprehensible or delivered in voices that seemed different from their normal speaking patterns. Children spoke with adult vocabulary and complex philosophical concepts, while adults used childlike phrasing to express ideas that seemed beyond their educational background. "The waking world is the dream," 8-year-old William Murphy announced during one of these nocturnal gatherings, his voice carrying an authority that seemed impossible for a child. "Sleep is when we return to truth, but she has shown us how to carry truth into the false world, how to remain conscious while others surrender to illusion." Margaret Collins, the boarding house proprietor, delivered lengthy discourses on the nature of time and consciousness that incorporated philosophical concepts she had never studied. "Linear time is a construction of the sleeping mind," she proclaimed to the circle of silent sleepwalkers. "True awareness exists outside temporal boundaries. Past, present, and future are simply different rooms in the same infinite house." Most unsettling was the apparent communication occurring between the sleepwalkers and someone who was not visibly present.
They would pause in their speeches as if listening to responses, nod in acknowledgement of instructions, and adjust their positions as if accommodating an invisible participant in their gatherings. Dr. Whitman suspected that Evangeline was somehow orchestrating these nocturnal assemblies, but his attempts to observe her during the sleepwalking episodes proved futile. On nights when the sleepwalkers gathered, Evangeline appeared to remain in her room at the boarding house, visible through her window as she worked on sewing projects by lamplight. Yet the sleepwalkers' behavior suggested they were receiving detailed guidance from someone with intimate knowledge of their personal histories, fears, and desires. As winter deepened and the isolation of Millbrook Crossing intensified, Evangeline's role in the community evolved from helpful seamstress to something resembling a spiritual advisor or teacher. Residents began seeking her out during daytime hours, not just for practical services, but for guidance on personal problems, philosophical questions, and the sleep disturbances that were affecting virtually every household. Evangeline received these consultations with gracious patience, offering advice that seemed remarkably insightful given her limited acquaintance with the town's residents. She demonstrated uncanny knowledge of family dynamics, personal histories, and individual psychological needs that would typically require years of close association to develop. Miss Harwick seems to understand people better than they understand themselves, Dorothy Chen told Dr. Whitman during one of his investigative interviews. She knew about my late husband's drinking problem, though I've never mentioned it to anyone in this town. She understood why my daughter has nightmares about drowning, even though the girl has never been near deep water. It's like she can see into our hearts and minds. This apparent psychic insight extended to practical matters as well. Evangeline began offering suggestions for improving agricultural techniques, railroad construction methods, and business operations that proved remarkably effective despite her lack of formal training in these areas. Railroad workers discovered that following her recommendations about work schedules and safety procedures resulted in significantly improved efficiency and reduced accidents. However, these beneficial contributions came with subtle but persistent efforts to change the community's relationship with sleep and consciousness. Evangeline began hosting informal evening gatherings where she shared what she called techniques for conscious living, methods for maintaining awareness during sleep, strategies for extending waking hours, and philosophical frameworks that reframe sleep as an unnecessary limitation on human potential. Sleep is humanity's greatest weakness, Evangeline explained to a gathering of interested residents in the railroad end's main room. For 8 hours each day, we surrender our will, our awareness, our ability to protect ourselves and those we love. We become helpless, vulnerable, disconnected from reality. Imagine how much more we could accomplish, how much safer and more fulfilled our lives could be if we learned to transcend this primitive need for unconsciousness. Her arguments were compelling, particularly to residents already suffering from sleep disruption and exhaustion. The idea that they could simply eliminate the need for sleep rather than struggle with insomnia seemed like an attractive solution to their mounting problems. On February 3, 1880, Dr. Whitman was called to attend to Jeremiah Foster, the town's blacksmith, who had suffered what appeared to be a complete psychological breakdown during the night. Foster's wife, Catherine, had awakened to find her husband standing in their kitchen, methodically destroying every timepiece in their home while delivering a rambling monologue about the artificial nature of temporal measurement.
At 3 p.m. sharp, the silver Camry pulled into Margaret's driveway. I watched on the tablet as Garrett and Sabrina, still calling themselves Michael and Sarah, approached the front door. Margaret answered wearing the perfect outfit for her role, a slightly outdated dress that suggested financial constraints, practical shoes, and jewelry that looked valuable but not expensive. She looked exactly like what they were searching for, a well-meaning elderly woman with assets but limited sophistication about protecting them. "Sarah, Michael, welcome. Please come in. I'm so excited to show you the house." The tour began in the living room where the main camera captured everything.
I watched them examine the space with the predatory assessment I remembered so well, noting the quality of the furniture, the artwork, the small details that revealed Margaret's financial status. "This is a beautiful home," Sabrina said in her disguised voice. "You can tell it's been lovingly maintained." "Thank you, dear. My husband Walter and I lived here for 38 years. He passed 2 years ago, and it's been so quiet since then." "I'm sorry for your loss," Garrett replied with practiced sympathy. "It must be difficult managing such a large property on your own." And there it was, the same opening gambit they had used on me. Sympathy, followed by the suggestion that managing property alone was too difficult for an elderly woman. Margaret played along perfectly. "Oh, it is challenging. The property taxes alone have nearly doubled in the past 5 years. I'm managing for now, but I worry about unexpected expenses." I saw them exchange that same quick glance I'd noticed at the cafe. In their minds, Margaret had just confirmed she was financially vulnerable. "Well, that's exactly why our arrangement could benefit everyone," Sabrina said. "We're not just looking for a place to rent. We're looking for a partnership." "Partnership?" Margaret asked with exactly the right tone of confused interest. "We believe in building equity together. Rather than just paying rent and getting nothing in return, we prefer arrangements where our contributions help improve the property value." There it was, the same sweat equity nonsense they had used to justify not paying me rent. I watched Margaret nod thoughtfully, as if this made perfect sense. "That sounds wonderful, but I'm not sure I understand how it would work." "Well, for example, instead of paying full rent every month, we might pay a reduced amount plus invest in property improvements. New appliances, landscaping, maybe some modernization projects that would increase your home's value. And of course," Garrett added, "we'd help with property management tasks. Dealing with repair people, handling maintenance issues, managing bills and paperwork. It can be overwhelming for someone your age to handle all of that alone." Someone your age. The condescension was exactly the same. Margaret asked the crucial question. "But wouldn't those improvements belong to me since it's my house?" Garrett's smile became slightly predatory. "Well, that's where the partnership aspect comes in. When tenants make substantial investments in a property, especially when they're helping with management responsibilities, they develop what's called equity interest. It's a modern approach that recognizes the value of the contributions both parties make." I felt my pulse accelerate. They were laying out their scheme exactly as they had with me, but this time it was being recorded from multiple angles. "I'm not sure I understand the legal aspects," Margaret said with perfect, innocent confusion. "Oh, don't worry about the legal details. We handle all of that. The important thing is that we're building something together that benefits everyone." They spent the next hour touring the house, and with each room, their commentary became more revealing. They discussed which walls might be removed to improve flow, which fixtures needed updating, and which furniture might be repositioned for better energy. In the kitchen, Garrett made a comment that sent chills down my spine. "This layout has real potential. With some strategic renovations, this could easily be worth 40 or 50,000 more than it is now." "Really?" Margaret asked. "That much?" "Oh, absolutely," Sabrina confirmed. "We've helped other homeowners realize significant value increases through smart improvements. Of course, once we've invested that much in improvements, it becomes more of a joint ownership situation." Joint ownership. They'd said it out loud, on camera, with crystal clear audio quality. Margaret played her final card beautifully. "Well, this all sounds very exciting, but I'd want everything properly documented. I'm sure you understand an old lady has to be careful about legal matters." "Of course," Garrett said smoothly, "though we find that too much paperwork can sometimes slow down beneficial arrangements. The most successful partnerships we've had have been based on trust and mutual respect rather than complicated legal documents." Translation: they didn't want any documentation that could be used against them later. After they left, I practically ran to Margaret's house. Harold was already there, downloading the video files and checking the audio quality. "Did we get everything?" I asked. Everything and more, Harold grinned. They just confessed to attempted fraud on multiple cameras with crystal clear audio. They described their entire scheme, the false partnership claims, the equity fraud, the gradual takeover strategy. What now?
Parents were deeply disturbed by their children's participation in these nocturnal gatherings, but attempts to prevent the behavior proved futile. Children who were locked in their rooms would somehow escape without triggering the security measures their parents had installed. Those who were watched continuously would fall into apparent sleep while under direct observation, then disappear during momentary lapses in supervision. Most troubling was the children's daytime behavior, which remained completely normal except for occasional references to concepts and experiences that seemed to come from their nighttime activities. They would demonstrate knowledge of subjects they had never studied, use vocabulary they had never encountered, and display understanding of adult problems and relationships that exceeded their developmental capacity. In mid-February 1880, Dr. Whitman requested a private consultation with Evangeline, ostensibly to discuss the community's sleep problems, but actually to confront her about her apparent role in the psychological disturbances affecting Millbrook Crossing. Their meeting, which took place in his office above Henderson's General Store, marked the beginning of Dr. Whitman's understanding of what he was truly facing. "Dr. Whitman," Evangeline said as she settled into the chair across from his desk, her pale green eyes reflecting the lamplight with unusual intensity. "I've been expecting this conversation. You're concerned about the changes occurring in your community, and you suspect that I'm somehow responsible for them." The directness of her approach caught Whitman off guard. He had planned to approach the subject gradually, using medical terminology and scientific principles to maintain professional distance from phenomena that challenged rational explanation. "Miss Harwick," he began carefully, "I've documented significant increases in sleep disorders, psychological disturbances, and behavioral changes since your arrival in Millbrook Crossing. As the community's physician, I need to understand whether these phenomena might be connected to your presence." Evangeline smiled with what appeared to be genuine warmth and amusement. "You're trying to find a medical explanation for events that transcend the limitations of your scientific training," she observed. "You've been educated to believe that consciousness operates according to fixed laws, that individual minds are separate and discrete entities, that sleep and waking represent fundamentally different states of being. All of these assumptions are incorrect." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze intensifying. "What you're witnessing in Millbrook Crossing is not pathology, doctor. It's devolution. These people are learning to access capabilities that every human possesses, but most never develop. I'm simply serving as a catalyst for transformations that were always possible." Dr. Whitman felt a strange sensation of vertigo, as if the room around him was becoming less solid and reliable. Evangeline's voice seemed to carry harmonics that registered below the threshold of normal hearing, creating resonances that affected his perception in ways he couldn't identify or resist. "The accident you mentioned, the head injury that changed your sleep patterns, what really happened in March 1872? Evangeline's expression became thoughtful, almost nostalgic. "I died, Dr. Whitman. For approximately 12 minutes, my heart stopped beating and my brain ceased all measurable activity. When I returned to life, I discovered that I had retained consciousness throughout the experience of death. Sleep became impossible because my awareness could no longer accept the illusion of unconsciousness." The matter-of-fact delivery of this impossible claim left Whitman speechless. Medical science had no framework for understanding consciousness that persisted through clinical death, yet Evangeline spoke about it as casually as describing a change in the weather. "During those 12 minutes, I learned that consciousness is not produced by the brain, as your medical texts claim. Consciousness is the fundamental substance of reality, and individual minds are simply temporary focal points within an infinite field of awareness. Death doesn't end consciousness, it simply relocates it. Sleep doesn't restore the mind, it temporarily disconnects us from our true nature." Evangeline stood and moved to the window, gazing out at the town where her influence was systematically transforming the lives of every resident. Following Dr. Whitman's unsettling conversation with Evangeline, the psychological transformation of Millbrook Crossing accelerated dramatically.
What had begun as isolated cases of sleep disruption evolved into a community-wide phenomenon that challenged every assumption about normal human behavior and social organization. By late February 1880, more than half the town's adult population was experiencing significant alterations in sleep patterns, consciousness, and social behavior. Railroad workers were maintaining their physical duties with unprecedented efficiency while engaging in philosophical discussions that would have been unimaginable months earlier. Shopkeepers and service providers were extending their operating hours indefinitely, claiming that they no longer required rest periods to maintain their energy and focus.
The transformation was particularly evident in the community's social gatherings. Evening meetings at the Railroad Inn evolved from simple social interactions into elaborate philosophical seminars, where residents explored concepts of consciousness, reality, and human potential with remarkable sophistication. These discussions were guided by Evangeline, but the participants demonstrated independent understanding and creative development of the ideas being presented. "We're becoming something new," Rebecca Patterson announced during one such gathering. "Not just individually, but collectively. We're learning to share consciousness, to pool our awareness and understanding in ways that multiply our capabilities beyond what any of us could achieve alone." The evidence for this claimed collective consciousness was becoming difficult to dismiss. Residents began demonstrating shared knowledge and coordinated behavior that seemed to occur without normal communication. Projects requiring collaboration were completed with precision and efficiency that suggested telepathic coordination. Problems affecting one family would be addressed by community-wide solutions that emerged spontaneously, without formal discussion or planning. Most remarkably, the practical benefits of these changes were undeniable. Millbrook Crossing was experiencing unprecedented prosperity and social harmony, despite the disruption of normal sleep patterns and psychological states. Crime had disappeared entirely, accidents and injuries had decreased dramatically, and productivity in all areas of economic activity had increased substantially. As the majority of Millbrook Crossing's residents embraced their psychological transformation, Dr. Whitman found himself increasingly isolated as the sole voice of medical and scientific concern. His attempts to document and analyze the phenomena occurring around him were complicated by his own growing susceptibility to whatever influence Evangeline was exerting on the community. During his nighttime observations of the sleepwalking gatherings, Whitman began experiencing his own alterations in consciousness. He would find himself standing among the circled residents without remembering how he had arrived there, participating in conversations that he couldn't later recall clearly, and waking in his own bed with knowledge and insights that seemed to come from external sources. His medical journals from this period reflect growing confusion and internal conflict between his scientific training and his direct experience of phenomena that defied rational explanation. Entries became increasingly fragmented and contradictory, alternating between clinical observations and personal accounts that read more like mystical visions than medical documentation. February 28, 1880. The Harwick woman demonstrates capabilities that violate fundamental principles of neurology and psychology. Yet the evidence of my senses confirms what my education insists is impossible. I am beginning to question whether my scientific training has prepared me to understand reality as it actually exists, rather than as academic theory suggests it should exist. March 2, 1880. Participated in gathering at creek clearing. No conscious decision to attend. Found myself present without memory of walking there. Experienced direct mental contact with other participants. Shared memories and thoughts that were not my own. Duration of experience unclear. Returned to quarters with understanding of concepts I had never studied. Medical explanation inadequate. March 5, 1880. Must resist growing conviction that Evangeline Harwick represents evolutionary development rather than pathological condition.
Scientific method requires skeptical analysis, but phenomena exceed current theoretical framework. Consider possibility that consciousness operates according to principles not yet discovered by academic investigation. By early March 1880, Dr. Whitman realized that Millbrook Crossing had crossed a threshold beyond which return to normal psychological and social functioning might be impossible. The community had developed its own internal logic and value system that operated independently of conventional social structures and scientific understanding. Residents no longer considered sleep deprivation a medical problem requiring treatment. Instead, they viewed their extended consciousness as a gift that allowed them to experience life more fully and contribute more effectively to their collective well-being. The psychological disturbances that had initially alarmed Dr. Whitman were now interpreted as evidence of successful transcendence of human limitations. Most troubling was the community's growing disconnection from the outside world. Telegraph communications had ceased after Henry Ashworth's breakdown, isolating Millbrook Crossing from news, commerce, and social contact with other settlements. Railroad workers continued maintaining the tracks, but showed little interest in the trains that passed through their station, viewing the broader world as trapped in primitive patterns of consciousness that Millbrook Crossing had evolved beyond. Why should we concern ourselves with the affairs of sleeping people? Evangeline asked when Dr. Whitman expressed concern about the community's isolation. They live partial lives, experiencing only fragments of consciousness between periods of unconsciousness. We have discovered how to live fully, continuously, without the interruptions and limitations that constrain ordinary human existence.
The logic was seductive, particularly for someone who was himself experiencing the expanded awareness and enhanced capabilities that seemed to accompany the psychological transformation affecting the town. Dr. Whitman found his resistance weakening as he recognized the genuine benefits that residents were experiencing: improved health, increased creativity, deeper social connections, and a sense of purpose and meaning that had been absent from their previous frontier existence. Yet his medical training continued to warn him that phenomena appearing beneficial in the short term might carry hidden dangers that would only become apparent over longer periods of observation. The complete absence of sleep among an entire population represented an unprecedented experiment in human consciousness that could have consequences extending far beyond the borders of a single Missouri railroad town. As winter gave way to spring in 1880, Dr. Whitman prepared to make a decision that would determine not only his own fate, but potentially the future of everyone in Millbrook Crossing. The woman who never slept had offered them a transformation that promised to transcend every limitation of ordinary human existence. The question that haunted Dr. Whitman's increasingly fragmented consciousness was whether transcendence and damnation might ultimately prove to be the same thing.